Hello and welcome back to Seeking Rents, the podcast. I'm your host, Jason Garcia. I'm the publisher of Seeking Rents. That's a newsletter in Florida about state politics with a particular emphasis on the ways big businesses and other special interests influence public policy in the state. Listen, this is going to be just another really quick hit daily podcast out of the organizational session of the Florida Legislature, which was gavelled in and out today after the election. I started doing kind of these quick rip podcasts during the last legislative session, and folks seem to enjoy them. So I figured I'd start that process back up again today with the org session. For those that don't follow, the org session is just a one-day session they hold shortly after the elections where all the new members are sworn in and the new leaders of the legislature, the new Senate president, House Speaker, officially take the reins of their chambers. Org sessions are very long on pomp and circumstance and very light on substance. There's usually a lot of really optimistic and high-minded sounded promises of things like member-driven processes and flattening the pyramid and stuff before everybody usually inevitably defaults to the normal dictatorial style of Tallahassee. But it's also an interesting chance it's the first time you hear from the presiding officers as the presiding officers, so you can start to get a little bit of a clue into what sort of they're most likely to pursue over the next 2 years. You get a sense of where Florida might be headed in a few places. It's the first time they meet with reporters in these new roles, so they answer a few questions that, again, can be somewhat insightful. Listen, it is very easy to get out over your skis reading tea leaves here, but, what the hell? Let's get out over our skis. So I think the biggest takeaway for me, the thing that jumped out the most to me was the new president of the Florida Senate essentially within like seconds of being sworn in, essentially rolled over and showed his belly to Ron DeSantis. And what I mean by that is, anybody who reads our newsletter or has listened to some of our podcasts, we spent a lot of time really digging into the governor just ran an utterly unprecedented taxpayer-funded campaign against two citizen-led constitutional amendments, two ballot measures, one that would have overturned the state's near total abortion ban and the other that would have legalized recreational marijuana in Florida. And the governor used we still don't exactly know how much, but something like $20 million of taxpayer money spent on ads and other campaigning against these amendments. And I and a lot of others have been trying to dig for specific answers to get more concrete details about how much was spent and, more importantly, where the money was taken from. For instance, we've got a pretty good indication that at least some of this money was cannibalized from opioid settlement funding. Money that is supposed to be spent combating opioid addiction in Florida was instead spent on anti-marijuana advertising, just as voters were deciding on whether to legalize recreational marijuana in this state. So I think, I can only really speak for myself, but there had been some hope that this new Florida legislature might actually demand some answers, because these guys sure as hell didn't put any line items into the state budget for this kind of advertising, right? This is all money that is being cannibalized and used in ways that, at minimum, were not contemplated at the time, and at maximum are directly counter to how the money was, or completely counter to how the money was supposed to be used. But instead, like 3 seconds, three or four lines into his new speech, Ben Albritton, who's a Republican from Wauchula, which is in the heartland area of Florida, kind of citrus cattle country sort of thing. He looked at Ron DeSantis, who was in the chamber for the speech, and essentially thanked him for all he did on the marijuana and amendment campaigns and for his leadership. There was, I immediately kind of like skeeted about that. I think I'm not sure if we're using the word skeet, because I guess that's got other meanings. But anyway, it jumped out at me, and I sort of posted that online. But I did sort of wonder, maybe I'm like overreading. Like I said, it's easy to get over your skis on, you're taking a line or two out of a speech and sort of trying to understand what the larger context around that. But no, it turns out it was exactly what it seemed like, because he was then asked about this stuff in a later meeting with reporters, and Ben Albritton made perfectly clear that he supported the governor's use of taxpayer money on political advertising. His argument was essentially that supporters of these amendments had been telling lies. Side note, they had not been telling lies, but that the state then had a duty to spend money correcting the record so voters could make an informed choice. So if you were sort of hoping that the Florida Senate might sort of take a principled stand on campaigning on public time or standing up to Ron DeSantis, that is not a promising start. It's same circus, different clowns, I guess. If there's even a remote silver lining here, the new Speaker of the Florida House, Danny Perez, a Republican from Miami, was also asked about this. He didn't address this in his own speech, but he was asked about it by reporters. He basically dodged the question. He was asked essentially in two different ways. Both times he kind of dodged and pivoted to this idea that, all taxpayer spending, all of our spending will be under scrutiny, which, it won't. There's just functionally, there's no way to scrutinize every dollar in a $117 billion budget. They're always picking and choosing what to prioritize, what to take closer looks at and stuff. So, I didn't walk away from that. You can't walk away from that thinking that, they're not going to look into this in the House, but you also couldn't walk away from that thinking that this was something they were particularly concerned about. So anyway, on a more sort of promising note from my perspective, as I mentioned, Danny Perez in his speech, for my money, the most kind of interesting, unexpected, and intriguing thing in any of these speeches was he had a line talking about how Floridians don't want to own homes. They don't want to be tenants to private equity firms. In fact, let me scroll to the exact quote. He said Floridians, they want to own their own homes, not be tenants to private equity firms, which was a really interesting sort of and very sort of specific call out. The Tampa Bay Times has been working on sort of a wonderful series about sort of corporate rolling up like mass ownership of homes, single family homes and apartments in the Tampa Bay region, particularly by institutional investors, private equity firms, Wall Street, that sort of thing, and how that is contributing to all sorts of problems, including just rising prices, but also other issues with like more aggressive evictions, more aggressive foreclosures, that sort of thing. So it was notable, not something I expected to see, that the Republican Speaker of the House sort of call out private equity in that way. And it does seem to be something that he's thinking about. He was asked about this. Danny Perez, the House Speaker, was asked about this in his meeting with reporters afterwards too, about the comment. And he did say, sort of private equity ownership, mass private equity ownership of homes is something he's concerned about. Didn't really give any sort of insights into what he might like to see done about this. And I got to be honest, I have not done a ton of reading about this, so I don't even know what the potential policy prescriptions are for something like this. But it obviously is something on their agenda. He kind of lumped it into just this broader focus. He said, if my main focus is going to be on affordability issues. So potentially something interesting could be coming down the pike there, trying to address, like I said, sort of mass corporate ownership of homes. One other thing from the Ben Albritton speech too, I probably should have mentioned earlier, was in addition to sort of giving Ron DeSantis his blessing to have burned $20 million in taxpayer money on political ads, Ben Albritton also basically made it clear he has no interest in rolling back or revisiting the state's near total abortion ban or expanding, liberalizing marijuana laws in any way, even though, the Amendment 4, the ballot measure that would have overturned the state's abortion ban, got 57% of the vote in Florida, which he got a higher share of the vote than Donald Trump himself did. He also got more than 1.5 million more votes than Ron DeSantis did 2 years ago. But that is not moving Ben Albritton in any way. I don't know that this was exactly new. I feel like I've read a story where he was quoted basically saying that he wasn't interested in doing anything on abortion or marijuana, despite sort of the strong majorities of support they got. Remember these things, marijuana got something like, I think, 55, 56% of the vote too. The only reason these things didn't pass is because Florida, unique among states for the most part, requires constitutional amendments to get 60% of the vote, a bar that, none of these politicians could clear in competitive elections themselves, but, safe in their gerrymandered districts, they're happy to claim that voters were misled in this case. So, but it's hard for me to get too worked up about this, only because I didn't really expect them to do anything on this. This is a Florida legislature that has made its contempt for voters in Florida perfectly clear over the years. And I mean, when I say contempt for voters, I mean for all voters outside of the very narrow sliver of primary voters that they are beholden to because they're living in these gerrymandered districts where, you'll have 2 Democratic seats in an area where Democrats have, there's like 30% more Democrats, and then surrounded by 7 or 8 Republican seats where there's 5 to 10% more Republicans in those seats. So these guys only ever really answer to their primary voters. And that's how you end up in a state where, 57% of the electorate wants to end government interference in abortion, but that same state has a legislature that has banned almost all abortions. And, we've seen this time and time again when Florida voters pass an amendment to make the state spend more money on land conservation. The legislature gleefully went around that amendment. They started spending the money on like pencils and salaries and all sorts of administrative overhead. They were like, hey, trust me, I watched this stuff play out. They were gleeful at the thought that they were outsmarting everybody by taking that money. They lotteried the bitch when voters passed 65% of voters passed a constitutional amendment allowing ex-felons who have completed their criminal sentences to get their voting rights back. They turned around and sabotaged that by requiring them to also pay all fines and fees. And then they turned around and they started giving folks approval to vote and then arresting them when they did vote. I mean, that's just how much they screwed with that amendment. We see this time and time again. The truth is, if Amendment 3 or 4 had passed, there would have been an enormous fight afterwards to try and get this Florida legislature just to abide by those amendments. So, again, you're dealing with a place that is so gerrymandered and so insulated from the vast majority of sort of popular thought or popular desire that there's just, again, it's just hard for me to get too upset with the fact that they're not responding to these amendments because they never expected them to. The reality is what they're going to do is they're going to get even more extreme on this stuff. Like we talked about this before the amendment passed. We've already seen a bill filed last year to ban abortion completely. There's already a movement afoot to establish fetal personhood. These are all stuff we've talked about before, but that's maybe what 57% of the vote gets you is that stuff doesn't pass this year. But Florida is going to get far more extreme on abortion before it backs down, unless there's another ballot measure that does get 60%. The other thing that was real quick worth noting, I think, neither of the guys, Ben Albritton, the Senate president, and Danny Perez, the House Speaker, got into a lot of detail about priorities. Ben Albritton hit pretty hard on the idea of prioritizing farming and food supply issues. That is not a surprise. As I mentioned, he's from the heartland part of the state. This is kind of like south central of Florida, like basically where there's a lot of cattle ranching, a lot of citrus groves, a lot of phosphate mining, that area. So he's kind of the farming culture. He actually ran for House Speaker a number of years ago, lost to Richard Corcoran of all people, and it was the ag industry was his biggest booster at that point. So that's sort of, I think, to be expected. Everybody's always seen that coming. I flag it only in that we're already seeing a lot of signs. We've written some about this on the newsletter that the sugar industry is likely to have some pretty significant, potentially controversial issues before this legislature, dealing with how much water gets out of Lake Okeechobee gets used for Everglades restoration versus reserved for sugar industry irrigation. And, there's plans afoot to build a rock mine kind of being pitched as a water reservoir on Everglades farming land. Those could very well be major fights in the legislature. Similarly, Mosaic, the big phosphate miner, we've alluded to this in the past. There's some issues looming. We've got the Trump administration is about to take over, is probably going to loosen the shackles on using phosphogypsum, that kind of the mildly radioactive byproduct from Mosaic's fertilizer manufacturing process, starting to allow that in road construction. So we could start to see more push around, radioactive roads in Florida. There's also, I'm certain there's legislation coming to try and incentivize Mosaic or other tech companies that want to try and extract critical minerals from the same phosphogypsum waste. So all of these are issues that are on the table, I think, for this session. And with Ben Albritton in the driver's seat, I think they'll get a lot of it. They'll get a lot of attention this session. Two other quick things. Danny Perez was much more sort of circumspect about not revealing any of his personal priorities this session, although he did sort of make a point of emphasizing the need to eliminate occupational licensing, that sort of thing. That doesn't surprise me that he's talking about this. Danny Perez is a former chair. I think he was the national chair of ALEC, the American Legislative Exchange Council. So he's kind of steeped in kind of that conservative think tank group. That said, this is actually one where I've kind of changed my mind over the years. I think I've talked about this on the podcast. I have come around to the conservative view on that occupational licensing. We need to scale all of that stuff way back, that those are generally more barriers to entry, and they, excessive occupational licensing and professional licensing does more to contribute to inequality than it does to protect consumers in any meaningful way. I'm not ready to throw them all out, but I suspect, if the Florida legislature wanted to push really hard in that direction, honestly, I would probably cheer them on for that part. So that's another thing that I was sort of encouraging. Kind of hope somebody maybe tells Danny Perez about the parasites that are car dealers and alcohol distributors too, because we could do a lot of good reform right there if we wanted to. And the very last thing I'll mention, this was again, this is may have been just a throwaway line in the speech, but like I said, let's get out over our skis a bit. Danny Perez had this line where he said Floridians don't want guaranteed income. So let me actually find the exact quote. So I have it. Right here. They said Floridians expect governments to maintain the road. This part of the road is a thematic thing in a speech, but they aren't looking for handouts or no interest loans or income guarantees, which just for my money was an interesting thing to choose there, because there is speaking of these right-wing think tanks, we've talked a lot about the Foundation for Government Accountability on this podcast. This is a billionaire-backed think tank that has been responsible for some of Florida's most anti-worker laws. They were the group that was really pushing to roll back child labor laws last session. They're out there in state legislatures around the country trying to preempt universal basic income programs. So, that seems to me like potentially a tell that we might see that FGA bill show up this session. Again, could be way overreading the tea leaves here, but I guess we'll know soon enough. Okay, I'm going to leave it there for this. That was sort of what stood out to me on the org session. We will, now that the legislature is back, they'll start meeting and doing like committee weeks soon, where they start to work on bills ahead of the session. We'll probably check in with some of these more shorter form updates during those committee weeks as well. And then once session rolls around, we'll start getting back to daily updates. But, I'm pretty open to the approach for this. If folks have different thoughts on sort of how they want these done or what they want tackled, maybe there's different ways we can approach it. Reach out anytime with comments or suggestions or feedback. I may throw these up on YouTube or TikTok as well too. So if you're watching them, if you happen to watch them, make sure you click like, subscribe, whatever buttons you can click. That really helps us cover the cost of a lot of reporting expenses like public records requests. Okay, we really will leave it out there, and we'll be back again later this week with another interview podcast with hopefully, if it comes together, one of my favorite journalists in all of Florida. So, okay, until then, see you soon. Bye-bye.